Hello, SPED 431. Welcome to week 3. We are going to go over the PowerPoint notes and lecture discussion that we would have had in class tonight, but since we've switched to the hybrid model, you will now be receiving these lecture notes via video. I will be recording them via screencast, and you will see that you have a YouTube link to view these lecture notes. If anyone's ever having any trouble with it, just let me know. We'll go ahead and get started so we can keep this short. Again, we're on week 3. On your own, you will need to have done the week 2 check for understanding quiz. If you saw the announcement that I sent out on Moodle, it shows that the quiz is now open every night that we have a check for understanding quiz until 11:59 p.m. So whether you're the first session or the second session, you'll have plenty of time to complete that. Again, they only take 15 minutes or less. Lesson outcomes for this PowerPoint presentation. At the end of this, we'll be able to define behavioral objectives and operational definition, explain the purpose of behavioral objectives, list the components of a behavioral objective and describe each, describe the IBSO or IBSO model for defining target behavior, compare the 3 tiers in RTI or response to intervention, and complete the first steps of the functional behavior analysis. That will be your assignment for the first part of your case study this week. The discussion part we won't worry about. We will do that in class together. So looking at chapter 3, preparing behavioral objectives. One of the first questions as I read through the introduction of this chapter was just thinking about how do you yourself define appropriate behavior in a classroom? If we had a group of teachers sitting around together, would we all define appropriate behavior exactly the same way? Think about different practicums, different classrooms you've been in. Do teachers have the same expectations? In some classrooms, it's perfectly okay for students to get up on their own and say, go sharpen a pencil or get a tissue or move around the room freely as the teacher's discussing. In other classrooms, that is not okay. So how do we decide what is appropriate and what is not appropriate? It's kind of based on our personal opinion, as long as that objective is clear to the students. So an important thing to note here, behavioral objective, you'll see a star there, look for this on the quiz. The definition of a behavioral objective, it is written after the behavior of concern has been identified and describes the behavior that should result from the instruction or intervention that is planned. Okay, definition and purpose. If you will, at the bottom of page 35, if you'll just pause this and take a minute to look at the vignette we're talking about here. It's entitled, Are We Talking About the Same Thing? So go ahead and pause, take a minute to read that. And then answer the following question. How could a behavioral objective have helped make the situation more clear? What benefit would this have had on the student? So clearly we have 2 different educators here who are thinking that they both have the same intended outcome, however, it was not defined. Therefore, we have 2 different outcomes that 2 people think are correct because we didn't define that. So the purpose of a behavioral objective is to identify specific outcomes of instruction and help the student identify what is expected of them. So thinking back to that first example in a classroom, is it okay in teacher A's classroom to get up and walk around during instruction time? Perhaps, as long as that is identified and that is objected to the student. Teacher B may not be, again, as long as we set those expectations for the student and they understand what is expected of them. IEP, we're going to talk about IEP development with behavioral objectives here later. The IEP, just keep in mind, is developed to set academic and or behavior goals operationalized by writing such objectives. So these objectives kind of drive the support services, everything else that happens in the IEP. Talking about pinpointing the behavior. Before we can write a behavioral objective, we must be able to pinpoint the behavior of concern. Be very careful, as most schools, we've talked about this, most schools utilize PBIS. Be very careful of that type of referral data. Say you're a special ed teacher and a gen ed teacher contacts you and says, I need you to come in. We're having a lot of trouble with Eddie. He's got 45 ODRs for the year. Okay. Now, there is data on an ODR or an office discipline referral or a PBIS referral. It depends on the school that you're in. Some of them call them different things. There is information on there, but it's more anecdotal and not necessarily the type of data that we would use to help us pinpoint a behavior or write a behavioral objective. While it's a good starting point, it poses us to ask further questions like, what does the student do? So describe to me what that looks like, what it sounds like, and what do you want the student to do instead? What is the expected behavior you want to see? On page 37, there are several examples there. I'm just going to go through one at the top here, page 37. Here would be maybe a teacher's complaint. Sebastian can't do his math. Okay, we need to pinpoint the problem. Is it that the problem that he doesn't know basic computation skills? Is it that he can't finish his problems within the time limit? Is it that he's refusing to attempt the problems? Maybe he can't get started. Maybe he needs a support in place to help him do those things. So we have to dig a little deeper. Referral data such as PBIS or office referral data will probably not give that type of information. So just know you're going to have to dig a little deeper. Also consider the type of data that you will want to collect. For a student who won't stay in their seat, and the book gave a good example of this, say a student who won't stay in their seat, what is the problem? Is the problem that they're getting out of their seat 20 times in a 30-minute instructional period? Or is it that they get out of their seat once and continue to wander the room during the length of that 30-minute instruction time? So as you're asking some of those probing questions, be sure to dictate whether they're looking for frequency or duration. And you'll see a note there. We will practice this skill in class tonight as we look over some videos. Hey, we're going to jump to talking about educational goals. Objectives should be derived from a set of educational goals that provide a framework for the school year. So this is kind of the basis for your IEP. We're going to talk about long-term objectives versus short-term objectives. And different states have different requirements. In the state of Iowa, it's kind of left up to the educator, but it's best practice that if you have a student with more severe or more intense needs, whether it be behavioral, academic, social, emotional, personal care, any life skills, any of those, you would probably break those up into shorter goals or objectives. So this is just describing the difference between a long-term educational objective and a short-term behavioral objective. So a long-term objective is a statement of the annual program intent. So what do we want to see the student do over the entire school year, usually described as 36 weeks. Short-term objectives, sometimes used in behavioral objectives, again, when the behavior is more intense is when you will tend to see more short-term objectives. So a short-term objective is meant to provide statements of instruction intent written into smaller steps. So what do we want to see that progress look like as we progress through the school year? Typically broken up into shorter periods of time, such as quarters, every 9 weeks, trimesters. It's kind of those baby steps to get to the long-term goal. Educational goals are written by the IEP team. Typically, the school IEP team, based on the data that they've collected, will have a goal in mind, but the IEP team with the parents and the whole team present are actually the ones that decide and determine that goal. We review current data to establish a baseline, so that is also done by the team. Must be written in ways that are observable and quantifiable, so we have to be able to see them and we have to be able to monitor them. And the severity of the disability determines the amount of goals. So again, it may determine how the goal is monitored. It may also determine the amount of goals that a student has. Obviously, for students with more severe, you may need to add several goals such as cognitive goals, communication goals, motor, gross or fine and or fine, social, self-help skills, vocational, maladaptive behavior. Where a student with mild behavior, you may not see all of those goals on an IEP. Components of a behavioral objective. So these are 4 components that must be met. Notice there's a star there, so note this for next week. 4 things your behavioral objective needs to have. It needs to be able to identify the learner. So who is our learner? Who are we talking about? Identify the target behavior. What do we want them to do? Identify the conditions of the intervention and the criteria for acceptable performance. And we're going to go over each of these in a little more detail. Identifying who the learner is, that's the easy part, right? It's just identifying the who. Maybe the who is Johnny will, whatever Johnny will do, or all 4th grade students will, or the participants of this class will. So that's the easiest part, really, is just identifying who it is we're talking about. The next part, identifying target behavior, identifies exactly what we want the learner to be able to do when the desired change has been achieved. So this serves 3 purposes. It ensures that the same behavior is being consistently observed. So we're not bouncing around with what behavior it is that we're documenting. We're always documenting the same behavior. So it's that consistency piece. Number 2, it allows for confirmation by a third party that the change has occurred. We call this the stranger test. So if I am not able to come to school anymore and someone else has to jump in and take my job, is my target behavior, is all of my explanation that I have there, is it clear enough that someone else could step in and see kind of where we started before, where we're intended to go, and have we been able to make that change? And number 3, it helps facilitate the continuation of instruction. So for example, I'm a 5th grade teacher. When my students are at the end of 5th grade, they leave my building and go to the middle school. I do not have direct contact with those teachers all day. I need to make sure that I'm writing target behaviors and that I'm writing specific enough intervention information, all of the data that's in there that those teachers can pick up where I left off, and that continuation of instruction looks the same so that the student is able to make progress. Again, we'll practice this tonight in class. Operational definition. This part is very important for our case study. So an operational definition, it's the definition under which everyone will operate when discussing observable, when we're talking about discussing, observing, counting, reporting, consulting. Anytime we're talking about the student's behavior, we're referring back to that definition. So it's very specific, and it helps us be able to know what that behavior looks like, sounds like. Operational definitions that contain too many factors are harder to trace. So if you look on page 41, in the first paragraph, it gives some good examples there. I'm not going to go over them at this time. Using precise verbs will also help clear up operational definitions. There is a great list of verbs on page 42 of your text. Again, just to make sure that we're measuring and talking about the same types of behavior. The IPSO test questions, is the behavior specific and objective? So when you are writing an operational definition, these are 3 questions that you can ask yourself to make sure that your operational definition is a good one. So, can you count the number of times that it is observed? So whatever the behavior is, Johnny hits. Okay, can you count that? Yes, you can count the number of times someone hits. Will a stranger know what to monitor? So again, if someone comes in and I say, I need you to track some data on Johnny, will she know what to look for? Will that person know what to look for based on my operational definition? And number 3, can you break the behavior down into smaller components? The answer should be no. If I say Johnny is aggressive, what does aggression look like? There's verbal aggression, there's physical aggression. Maybe hitting and kicking are for 2 different reasons. So we shouldn't be able to break that down into smaller components. It should be really it should be very clear to anyone that's looking at that. Conditions of an intervention. Conditions, 2 weeks ago we talked about antecedent stimuli. Conditions is basically the antecedent stimuli that includes instructions given to the student, materials that they're using, the setting, and there is a good list of examples on page 43 of different conditions, so you can review those. Again, we'll practice those tonight in class. Identifying the criteria for acceptable performance. So this is setting the standard for the minimally accepted performance. On page 44 of your text, there is a short list towards the bottom there of just some different examples of criterion statements. We want to make sure when we set criteria that we're setting criteria standards that are both ambitious yet attainable. We don't want to set a criteria that's too easy that the student's going to be able to achieve it within a matter of weeks, yet we also don't want to make it so difficult for them to achieve that they may likely never achieve it. So you also have to kind of think about the time frame in which you want them to achieve that. We'll work more on that as we talk through goals a few weeks into the class, a few more weeks. In addition to setting standards for percentage or frequency, make sure that the number of times the criteria needs to be met is considered mastery of the skill. On the bottom of page 45, it gives some good examples here as well. So maybe we want to see that Jenny remains in her seat for 85% of the class period, but is that just once and she's achieved mastery? Is it for a consecutive 9 weeks? Is it 4 sessions? Will we know that she's met mastery if she's doing that 4 out of 5 school days? So we kind of need to set that time frame too. How many times do we need to see the behavior before we consider it mastered? Formatting for behavioral objectives. I think this is one that people get stuck on a lot. It's like, how do I write this? There is really no perfect way to write it as long as you make sure that you have all of the components in. We're going to practice this tonight with some behavioral objectives and goal writing and making sure that we have all of the components. But there are some good examples on page 46 that I just wanted to point out. The first 2 examples, one is format 1, the other one is labeled format 2, and it just shows different ways that you can write your behavioral objectives. You'll know once you get comfortable with it what your own style is. Behavioral objectives and the IEP. So how does it all fit? So IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, regulates 6 elements that are part of the IEP. And behavioral objectives, again, are very important in this. They kind of help drive it. Number 1, we always need to have a statement of the student's current level of performance, or the PLAP, for those of you who are familiar with that term. Number 2, a statement of measurable annual goals. What do we want to see them achieve within the school year or within the next school calendar year? Appropriate objective criteria and evaluation procedures. Statement of specific services and supports related to the student. So now that we've identified where the student's at, where we want the student to get, how are we going to get them there? What services and supports will help them meet those goals? Number 5, projected dates for initiation of services. So when will the services start? How will we know that it's time for them to end? Excuse me. And number 6, the extent of which a student will participate with their non-disabled peers. So that's just that professional bias part. How often can we get those kiddos participating with their peers? And a lot of times this is where we have to think about what is it about their disability keeps them maybe from participating as much as we would like them to with their non-disabled peers. Again, that helps us drive objectives. It helps us know what services and supports to give a student. RTI, hopefully you've all heard this term before, response to intervention. Eligibility for special education services requires the existence of a disability based on the effect it has on students' learning. So different states are different. Iowa is a non-categorical state. So what that means is that if I'm a student with a disability, I don't have to have a note from my doctor. Okay? I don't have to have a diagnosis of autism to learn like a student with autism. In Iowa, we just recognize as eligible individuals. So if a student's perceived or founded disability has an effect on their educational on their whole as their education as a whole, whether it's social, emotional, behavioral, academic, if that's affecting their learning to where they're discrepant enough from their peers that they need additional services, then they're eligible in Iowa. Other states like South Dakota, Nebraska require a diagnosis, but again, it just depends on the state that you're in. A way that we kind of how we start to look at whether or not students are going to qualify for special education services is through the RTI model, or that response to intervention. RTI is a tool that is used to help teams decide the level of services and support a student needs to be successful. So tier 1 support would be kind of what everybody is doing in the school, the grade, any classroom practices that are best practices that account for good instruction and just your general classroom management. So a student who can maintain and keeps up academically and behaviorally with the other students with just the regular supports that every other kid gets would be considered a tier 1 student who would not qualify for any further services. Once we move to tier 2, we're looking at more targeted strategies, such as small group instruction. This can be either for behavioral or social emotional, academic, anything really. But that's just saying that what we're doing with the group as a whole is not enough for this student, and we need to give them some more targeted strategies. Maybe if it's academic and it's a reading deficit, maybe they're in a small group phonics. They get some small group phonics work to help build those skills to then promote fluency. If it's behavior, maybe it's that a student is not clearly understanding the expectations of the classroom. So maybe we're doing some small group with them to practice following directions. This is kind of the intervention process. So these would be steps we would put in place before we would recommend a student be looked at for special education services, which is tier 3. So once we hit tier 3, that is where special education services come into play, and they're individualized to meet the student's needs, either behaviorally, socially, academically, again, life skills, hygiene, any of those things, depending on the student need. In class tonight, we are going to look at one of the case studies. So we'll work on that together and do some practice before I set you free to do your assignment. So for this week, you have your case study assignment number 1. You'll see the highlighted boxes in the assignment submission link on the Moodle site. It's due by this Friday at 11:59 p.m. For next week, you'll need to read chapters 4 and 5 over data collection and how to show that data. Preparing for week 4 in-class discussion. We will take our week 3 check for understanding quiz next week. And then if you just want to look over case study assignment number 2 and have kind of an idea of what that looks like in your mind before we meet next week, that'll give you a little head start. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you know how to reach me, and I will see you all in class.